Welcome back to r/advertising school. This is advertising school number 204 with Holland, Martini, and Maria Vorovich. This is our first return guest to r/advertising school, which I'm super excited about. If you missed it, I will put a link in the description to Maria and Holland's first talk, which was super insightful. If you're interested in joining these sessions live, shoot an email to radvertisingschool@gmail.com, info in the description. And without further ado, I would love to introduce our two guests. Holland and Maria, you both have some amazing agency experience. You have really interesting backgrounds. I think like a very different backgrounds from most folks in the advertising world. Starting with Holland, can we hear like a little bit about your background and why you decided to kind of go the entrepreneurial route?
Yeah, of course. So my background is a little bit different than the typical agency creative. That's where I ended up at Gray, which is a creative agency, but I actually started in the data world. So I was an economist, statistics, super nerd. The only reason I'm not wearing my glasses right now is because there's a major glare. But I kind of started in that world right when advertising saw the benefit of data and the impact of data and the impact that it could have on strategy and business and just how much more confident it was making advertisers. And so I was kind of quick to pick up on that. And I immediately shifted gears 10 years ago into a media agency that started using data to inform some of their content creation. And from that, bopped around, worked at J&J for a little bit when they saw the benefit of that, and then was ultimately hired at Gray to start a data strategy team. I am convinced I coined the word data strategy. And so, essentially what that is how do you use data to actually inform strategy and business? How do you make it understandable? Not data for data's sake, not data in an Excel spreadsheet, but in an insight that's exciting that creatives want to gather around. And I think, and this might steal a little bit of Maria's answer as well, so sorry in advance, but what made us really want to go the entrepreneurial route is there was this massive shift in the industry of data kind of being a focal point of strategy, and not just feeding creative strategy, but business strategy overall for product development, for customer, experience, et cetera. And so when we looked around, we realized creative agencies were buying up data shops to kind of backfill and do this. Data and like big consulting companies were buying creative agencies to sort of create that offering, and no one built it from the ground up. So it just wasn't succeeding. And I think, it took a little bit of Maria noticing it and feeling like it's an issue on her end, who has a completely different background as me. And then me seeing that exact same issue from the other end. And if both people, 360 are kind of seeing this issue and no one's doing anything about it, we felt really confident that we could start something that would ultimately solve for that problem, which is what we call creative research. It's essentially research and data that is creative by nature. It uses concepts that are more creative, not necessarily creative like you think about like an actual campaign. In terms of personal aspects, why you want to be entrepreneurial, I think in agency life, and I'll be completely transparent, you can get into these situations where you're hired to do something, and you do a really, really good job, and they kind of start giving you more tasks. Yep. And then you realize you built a gigantic thing for somebody else and it's all yours. And whoever's hired next, it just becomes theirs. And I, wasn't interested in that. So, by building GoodQues, we kind of got to have a baby and keep it.
And so, I mean, the hypothesis was true. I mean, as proven by the success of your practice, GoodQues, goodquest.com. We'll put that in the description as well. Obviously, Maria and Holland are the founders of that. And it's a super interesting shop. Like just reading through the website, I think you get a feel for the different kind of just thinking and approach that you both kind of apply to these like business problems. Maria, like I'm going to scoop a little bit of news that I saw on LinkedIn about you, that you have this South by Southwest talk coming up, which is about businesses asking the wrong questions. I'm like framing a super hard like intro question for you, but I'd love to hear about like your background, your path to GoodQues, and maybe like, can we get a little teaser of like what the talk's gonna be about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Holland kind of teed up, I'm the complete opposite skill set of her. So, if she's a math nerd, I have trouble adding 1 + 1. I just wasn't born with that part of the brain. I am a brand builder at heart. I'm a wordsmith. I used to be a CSO at a previous agency, chief strategy officer. I used to oversee copy departments. So that's my skill set. And so for me, I absolutely love data. I absolutely love research, but I come at it from a very sort of humble place of not knowing how to do it firsthand. And I think often that's where, real fresh thinking and ideas come from when they're lateral. And they don't come sort of from the ground up of being in that world. So I was always tangential to that world. I knew that I had to use data and apply research to my thinking, but I didn't know where to start. And I think, that ties in a little bit to the South by Southwest talk, because, again, for me, it started from, not how can we be the most clinical? How can we be the most sort of true to tradition? But instead, how can we be most honest to the business problem that we're solving for? I know what I have to do as a brand builder. I know where I want to get to, and I have about 1 billion questions before I get there. But the way at them is very different from, again, traditional research perspective, which tends to be, I think, in my experience, quite rigid and doesn't take in a lot of creativity because it wasn't built that way. So when you can take what you learn from copywriting, when you can take what you learn from creativity in brand building and, campaign building and all of that, and when you apply that to research, that's when some real interesting magic happens. And I think that's part of what we're bringing to the table with GoodQuest, but also what we want to talk about at South by Southwest. And I think all of that sounds really heady. I have a tendency to talk philosophy, and everyone's like, "What?" So I think if I were to ground that, I'll give you guys a really human example. So this has actually been proven out by other researchers, not Holland and I, but there's a finding that if you're engaging with kids, right? Say you pick up your kid after school and you ask them, how was your day? The question is so broad that it doesn't allow the child to give you any kind of answer, right? Usually what you get is like good, okay, fine, right? Like completely a non-starter. Versus if you ask a very pointed question, if you ask something about, how was math class today? Or, how are your friends feeling? Or, did you finally score, in your basketball game? Because it's so pointed, it allows the person to actually give you a more interesting answer, a more nuanced answer, a deeper answer. And, that's application in the real world, but that's how we think in our business as well. How do we avoid generalities? How do we avoid anything that, again, feels too staid or too informal? How do we make something, even like a survey, feel like a conversation? And that's what we're spending a lot of time doing. And again, I think my background sort of lends to this kind of divergent thinking, if you will, in research.
I love that. I mean, I think, and I'm sure you both run into this problem all the time of folks who believe that data is this linear, straightforward, like non-biased thing that just tells us the truth. And like one of my favorite psychologists makes this critique of that view of data as being, imagine you're trying to walk through a field in front of you. You could have every single piece of data about that field, but it does not tell you the right path to walk through the field. It doesn't tell you like how to maneuver in the world, because there's too much of it. Like there's an infinite amount of data we could collect about one stupid plant in that field. And so it's this idea that like you need a creative lens to the way that you interpret data. I feel like that's like, it's so important and true. Like, how do you, I guess, this is really for both of you, because I'm sure you both have very different perspectives on this, but how do you approach, and what you might classify like an analytical thinker who believes that they already have the right data and that they already have the answer, and you're in a situation of saying like you're not even asking the right questions. How do you broach a conversation like that?
Well, this is going to be a provocative answer, I think. But I think part of it is based on the dynamic of the company. I don't think anyone thinks that they have a data point and that is the end all be all. But I think when you silo departments and one person has a deliverable and it goes to another person who maybe doesn't agree with it, then you just like fight for like, but I did this, that's right. And if the other person is like, oh, I'm not really interested in that, or like, I don't agree with it, and they're two siloed kind of or parts of the organization, then you get one person who's like, hey, why aren't you listening to me? And another person who's like, I don't want to listen to you, right? And I think that's a huge problem, which is why when we did kind of find GoodQuest and start developing the team, we made sure that every data strategist, it was paired directly with the strategist and they work hand in hand the whole time. So that never happened. And I think, so that's the background. I think that's why it's happening. I think a lot of it is, you know, the way that the organization has been structured and the way, you know, historically data has been incorporated into things. It was to validate, it wasn't to inspire. So, you know, when you're validating something, it is right or wrong, it's black and white. And then when you start to try to inspire and then, you know, you start siloing groups, it just becomes hard. And people just want to fight to be heard. And sometimes that means just listen to my data, even though you know that you need to put the creative lens on it. Now, that being said, when it comes to people who do think the data is the end all be all, I think a lot of it is just taking them on a journey of like, well, what does this really mean? And I think a lot of it it can be fixed when you just speak the same language, which we talk about a lot, right? I think data oftentimes gets, you know, poo-pooed or eye rolled because the person with the data doesn't know how to speak the language of the creative or the strategist.
Right.
And I think just getting everyone on the same language is really helpful, right? So an example of like, oh, people who buy Jordans are 100 times more likely to like the color black. All Jordans should be black. But like, let's back up. How many people are actually buying Jordans, right? Like, should we make every shoe black? Like, and then when you kind of, it's all about perspective, right? When you give that perspective, you can start level setting with people. That's my approach, but that's also from the data side, right? So I try to build that perspective by making data feel more tangible.
I mean, that I like want to highlight something that you just said, which I think is like super insightful, and that data is so often used to validate, not to inspire. It's like, and it comes down to like, yeah, businesses are run by humans and like egos are part of every business conversation. And beyond that, it's like, you know, I see this in my social media practice all the time. Like so often, you know, when I look through a brand's historical social media reporting from the previous agency that they worked with, I see these analytics reports that are trying to paint these rosy pictures of, let me prove out the value of what I've done, and not let me evaluate what's working and try to improve and iterate in the next creative cycle or the next batch of content that we're making. Like, I think that's such a like, man, that one sentence, it just like diagnoses the problem. Like, well said.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Maria, go. Or did I?
No, I was actually going to answer the question. I saw the question and I think it's a great one. You know, how does your data inspire marketing strategy for brands? There's a million ways, right? And I can give some case studies, for example, just to be able to wrap your head around it. So one example is actually for Constellation Brands, which is a holding company for a suite of different alcohol brands. And their question was, so there are all these cultural trends in the world, right? And we never know which one to jump on. There's literally, right, like we can all think of at least 10 off the top of our head. How do we know which one to talk about? How do we know which one to capitalize on? How do we know which one is a blip on the radar, which is what is a long-term trend? And a lot of these companies are so big, they need to take advantage of more long-term trends, because by the time they innovate, by the time they, you know, get the ball rolling.
Right.
And so what we were able to do for them is we were able to quantify trend trajectory, meaning which trends are going to be speeding up, which ones are going to be slowing down. And based on that, what is the right fit for Constellation Brands? So say, okay, we think this trend is at the peak, which means it's going to be decelerating, which means by the time you get to talking about it or doing something about it, it's on the decline and you're no longer relevant. Versus this trend is just starting to pick up, and this is a really prime opportunity for you to jump on it and start talking about it, because by the time it hits its peak, you might be perfectly in line with, you know, with market materials. So,
and is that a process that does the client use that at the stage of product development, of building marketing campaign? Like, where do you see people integrating those kinds of insights?
Everything.
Interesting.
So that kind of project, you can integrate that into product development. It could be a new line, right? A subline or something like that. It could be just simply communications. That one you can apply to anything. Other more straightforward ways of using data is we had a client called Bitstamp. So Bitstamp is the #1 cryptocurrency exchange in the EU. And they were big in the EU, obviously, but they had never come to the US officially, formally. They've never launched. And they said, okay, we're ready to launch in the US, but we have no idea who we're talking to, how many of them are out there, where they are, what they're talking about. And so we started to dig into that. And what we were able to do is literally find out, again, the viable market size, or meaning, how many people are out there in the US are going to be interested in a product like Bitstamp. And that can dictate, your marketing spend, right? Based on how many people you expect to convert, you can decide how much money you invest. Also, we were able to find out who these people are, what makes them tick, what makes them interested. And that's the tweak of like the marketing strategy. One really interesting example from that project was that we learned that no one in cryptocurrency, no matter how seasoned they are, considers themselves an expert. Because it's such a new space. Yeah. You always feel like you're chasing. Even if you're there from the beginning, even if you're mining for Bitcoins, you feel like there's someone out there that knows more than you. And you're probably thinking like, well, what do I care for a marketing strategy? Well, their whole platform was a platform for experts. But if no one considers themselves an expert, it's a platform for no one, right? So that's the kind of thing that becomes really interesting.
To be able, I mean, that exactly fits with the talk title. I get it. That is not a question that most brands kind of ask. Like, am I even talking to the right audience? Like, I'm sure that seemed really obvious to them as they grew organically, that they accumulated users who seemed like they're like deep in dialogue, and they probably see a lot of user behaviors that they interpret as, oh, these must be experts. But to say that that's the opposite of how their audience actually feels that's like, both conditions can be true, but they need to action based on like how the audience feels about it. That's super interesting.
Yeah, Joe, you just said something that was like kind of like nail on the head of a lot of what we try to tackle in business. They don't feel like it. So a lot of companies, when they do research, are like, how many people are on an app 2 times a day, have more than one app, understand this? If then, they equal an expert. But they don't ask, do you feel like an expert, right? Yeah. How do you feel? What are the emotions behind what you're doing as a business or like as a consumer, right? And I think that is a lot of what we're trying to tackle too. So when we think of creative research, it's not just the output, right, as well, which, is quite different. It's also the input. Like, are you thinking about every aspect of the business? And are you making sure you're kind of quantifying that emotional piece, which I think is something that is not traditionally thought of in research, because when you think of numbers, you think of function, and quantifying emotion feels so heady, right? But we're getting there, and by simply just asking the right questions, you just get one step further.
So what's it been like to, I'm sure that now on the other side of having like built this practice and having worked with clients over, it's been 2 years, right? Like, are you on 2 years? Yeah. Wow. That's crazy.
We're going on 4. Yeah.
Are you for real? Oh my gosh. I'm like underselling you guys. My bad.
No, Joe.
Like, how dare I? You're now probably on the other side interacting with many of the agencies that you worked at or worked closely with or were skeptical of or whatever. Like, what's it like to now interact with kind of the traditional players in the space now that you have this kind of lightness and this owned practice of yours?
I think for me personally, it's constantly a learning experience. I think that's the only way to think about it, and I think learning experience of taking the positives, but also taking the negatives. I think the human element is such a powerful one. And even if you're at a traditional shop or a big shop, right, it's the individual that actually matters and what they contribute. And so if I'm being very honest, every time we work with a shop, we're like, okay, those practices were absolutely horrible. Let's never adopt that. Or we're like, this was really enlightening and really interesting, and we love the way that they led that meeting or asked those questions. We should adopt that. So, I don't want to be on a pedestal and poo-poo other companies. I think that as a startup, the one benefit that we have is not that we're better, but it's that we're more nimble. Bigger companies have a much harder time adopting and changing, whereas we can do it in a number of days, right? So for us, it's just faster of learning what works, what doesn't, and changing and shape shifting. And unfortunately, as you get bigger, that's just harder to do. And I think that's the biggest benefit of being smaller. And even though we're 4 years old, I very much still consider ourselves a startup as compared to even our alma mater, the gray, of the world.
Interesting. So in what ways do you kind of treat your company as a startup?
In every way, right? I think it's plan to pivot is the number one thing, right? Holland and I talk about this, every single week when we have our little management meeting of, what do we have to change, right? And the change is constant because, we kind of have this belief system of if you're not changing, you're going to be outdated. And so you have to, right? It's never, even if you have something that's really, really good and it's working, it's never going to work forever. So you have to just constantly evolve. And so our evolution is, it's going to happen tomorrow. If we talk in a month from now, GoodQues will be slightly different than it is today.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
I think that's like the biggest benefit of not being big, So when we think about like agency world, as we do grow, there are things that happen where we're like, oh, that makes sense. We used to say like, we never need a project manager. We can use a tool for that. And then you get big enough and you're like, ooh, I could really use a project manager.
Yes,
but then there are other
absolutely.
things like, making some solutions one size fits all, where that makes sense when you have 500 people doing something, right? But when it comes to us, we don't need to do that. We have the bandwidth to kind of be nimble and change our teams and think differently and think creatively, because it's a small team and everyone kind of has the same mission and we're all speaking the same language and we all communicate every day. So yeah, for me, it's just been an interesting learning lesson of like where it makes sense, where it absolutely made no sense, and where, just by nature being not like, we don't consider ourselves an agency at the end of the day. So like not being an agency allows us to be, honestly, like have a competitive advantage.
Totally. And it probably makes agencies much more comfortable working with you if you don't call yourself an agency, because now you're not in the same competitive niche, or at least they don't categorize you that way. Purva, if you are interested in unmuting and asking, like, please feel free to. Otherwise, I will just read your question for you. All right, we're gonna. We're thinking about it. We shy? We're too shy? Okay. What kind of data sources are used to drive the kinds of strategies I'm guessing that we talked about before? So, thinking about these kind of like fundamental business questions, what are the data sources that you're using? How do you kind of flex between sources? How do you choose what you're gonna look at?
Yeah, I can go with this one. I think the benefit, again, of being small is that, we don't need to subscribe to one syndicated resource, right? And that's actually something that is a big point of differentiation for GoodQues. We don't really utilize syndicated resources. Our whole theory is that if you can buy a syndicated resource, so can your competitor, and there's no IP there. There's no competitive advantage from the data that you're getting. So everything that we do is completely first party. And ultimately, it really depends on what the client ask is. We run studies all the time, which would be like what you would call quantitative data, right? Which isn't really a source. We're the source. We're running the study and creating the research project and diagnosing the questions. We do qualitative as well. And again, it's not like necessarily a focus group. Sometimes we have like literally games. Like we had a drinking game for one of our big beer companies as part of qualitative. Like I cannot tell you the insights that came out of that. Like
That's
quite
amazing.
literally. But why not, right? I mean, everyone, like there's just ways to be creative about it. We use AI a lot, and we use AI to be, and this might sound reverse, like not only smarter but faster, and sometimes faster over smarter, because AI is only as smart as the person who wrote the code, right? So what it allows us to do is look through data, data at scale, and identify themes that are objective themes, and then allow us to go in and apply like the art to it, the why that we get at. And we're always pivoting, as Maria said, like, you know, whenever something new comes up, our team we're not just made of data analysts, right? We're made of strategists and creatives and engineers and people who just are interested in all aspects of the world. And I think that one thing that's interesting too is like data is no longer a number. I think we think about it like that a lot, but data can be a sentence, data can be a trend, data can be a bunch of images that show up, right? Which can be quantified eventually, but when you have different mindsets, we're always computing and thinking about different ways to bring that in. So answer, non-answer.
No, that's super insightful. And I feel like that's like, you know, I mean, it just recontextualizes, I think, or it helps to push along this recontextualization that's so important now, like that creative is informed by some level of like real reality, and data is like, maybe that's one way that like we can say it, is that like data is just like the like anchor of reality for this like kind of creative thinking, you know, because we have to butt up against reality at some point. The conference room brainstorms of big creative agency world are some of the most frustrating, out of touch conversations that I've ever been witness to. That said, like I've been in some amazing brainstorms with some amazing people in creative agencies. I'm not at all shooting down the talent that lives in those houses, because I mean, you know, we're all kind of in some way carrying on the parts that we liked from those practices.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, I think reality is an interesting way to think about it, but funny enough, in my head, it's actually completely the opposite. You know, if I were to give you guys a visual of the way that I think about it when we do research, I think about, you know, I don't know if you guys remember that movie Being John Malkovich, right? When you can like jump into a little portal and become someone you've never met. That's exactly what research is to me. It's actually a dose of dreaming to some degree, right? You are who you are. You know, say you're a creative that works in New York City, that goes to your cubicle every single day, right? You were raised in the Northeast, you're 6'2", whatever it is, right? And suddenly what you get to do with research is you get to jump into the body and perspective and emotions and existence of someone completely different. Someone who's maybe 5'1", who grew up in, you know, the Bible Belt, who has a completely different experience, who's never been to New York City, who doesn't know what a cubicle looks like because they work on, you know, in a factory, making it up, right? But the only way that you could jump into that existence is through data and research. And I think it's our responsibility to deliver that in an honest, very human way. But, you know, it's less about, hey, here's your dose of reality. It's here's your chance to see from the perspective of in a way that we never get to do in our everyday because we're so locked in our own minds, you know? So that for me is like what I love about the research and the data.
Yeah, I mean, it brings you this like genuine empathy for what it's like to live the experience of your, I think that, well said. Touche. I think it's consummate. I think it's you're experiencing their reality. Okay, so I want to change gears a little bit, because this is something that you guys have unique insight on and that comes up in the r/advertising community all the time. We have a constant trickle of people who have been in agency world for a while, are considering the new business or the entrepreneurial route or the independent route. And the question that is constantly asked is like, how do you get your first clients? And I have answered that question a bunch on this channel and in the community, but I'd love to hear from you both. Like, how do you approach potential clients? How do you think about who might be a potential client? What are your initial conversations like?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah. Okay. We were joking before this. We're like, how do we know who talks? And I was like, I'll text you. And then we just didn't. Yeah, for me, I can say that persistence is key. You know, it might feel a little uncomfortable, but if you have contacts, just letting them know what they're up to, and also not coming in, you know, there's a lot to learn. So I think when you go in there and you're like, I have this product that I'm going to sell you and you're going to love it, you know, you might not be as successful as like, hey, I loved working with you and I have an idea and I want to run it by people who like I really appreciated and I think I can learn from. And that immediately opens the door. And then you learn and you get to tell them about what you're doing and it helps you future proof. I mean, for us, we were just persistent with the people that we knew. And again, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because if you want to ever run a business, that will be your everyday. And if it starts with an email to someone you haven't talked to in 3 years, and could tell you it's going to feel a lot better than some things you're going to do 4 years later. For me, that's high level. I'd love to hear what Maria is going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to give 2 points of advice. I think one is a little bit more philosophical and one's a little bit more, you can action it tomorrow. So I think the philosophical thing is stop thinking about what you can offer people, what your skill set is, and start thinking about what they need.
Yes.
I can't tell you that enough. I mean, even as a business owner, we get pitched every single day with at least 20 emails of what someone can do. And it always starts with their skill set. We do X, Y, Z. We do this. Never once has anyone said, what do you need? Or, hey, we think you need this, and I think we can help, right? And I can't tell you how important that is. It seems so easy, but it's really hard. And as a philosophy, I think that's one of the things that's helped us tremendously, because we avoid that like the plague. We try to never, come at people with this is what we do. It's always, hey, this is how we think we know you're doing research and we think we can make your research better by X, Y, Z. So that's number one. And then the second point, Holland touched on it in terms of being uncomfortable, but the build on that is start with people you know. There are people in your life who will sign with you, who will give you work, who will, lend a hand, and that's your greatest ally. We started with people we'd worked with, friends, acquaintances, and out of that pool starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger, but start with that immediate circle.
I love that. I mean, I think that's the advice of going to people as people and not as like customers, or like, I'm gonna give you my pitch, is it's such a fundamental mindset shift. Like so many of the kind of young folks in this space who I see kind of going out on their own, who I do initial kind of like chats with, their mindset is like interview mode. They want to list all of their accomplishments and all of the different things that they could do. But when you think about the perspective, and this is just good marketing. If you think about the perspective of the person who wants to hire you, it's like they have a limited amount of internal resources. There's a bucket of money that you need to fit under in order for them to like justify hiring you. You need to fit into their scheme. They're not going to fit into your scheme. And that's like, I think that's, I'm reiterating what you both said, because I agree with you so much. What is an intro conversation like with you both? Do you both join? Is it like is a kind of just like get to know the business? Do you have a set of questions that you ask?
Yeah, that's another really interesting one. The truth is, we talk about this very often. We thought about, bringing on someone who will help us with new business, things like that. But we realized that, we will always be the best salespeople because we believe so wholeheartedly in our ethos. And not that anyone who joins our company doesn't believe in it, but, they haven't built it, so they can't speak to it as, hey, this was annoying to me, so I made this.
Yes.
And I think that, sort of that level of authenticity and that ability to speak to exactly why you've made the decisions that you have, I think really is interesting for people. Holland and I tend to do most of our new business together, because if you haven't noticed, we're kind of like the yin and the yang of the business, right? Holland is a little bit more of the smart one. And, I'm a little bit more of the, the wacky one, right? So between the two of us, we kind of get to something good. And I think, when you lack one or the other, it doesn't feel the same. And, I think that's a really big part of it. Otherwise, you never know. Sometimes it's a little bit more casual and it's a conversation. Sometimes it's, a little bit more formal and it's taking someone through an introduction deck. That's, I'll leave it there, except I will say one other thing. As a tool for selling, if you're starting a new business of any kind, as staid and old-fashioned as it seems to have some kind of introduction deck, it is an invaluable tool, because it actually, for me, it's less about sending it to other people and more about you being forced to focus yourself. and really write down on paper what you stand for, what you deliver. And it allows you to, instead of being all over the place, just being very single-minded.
That's super interesting. I think that, I mean, those initial slides, I think, are their importance goes beyond the slides themselves, because what you're doing in the process of making those is you're condensing your own message. Like, what is this thing? If I had to put it on a slide that I'm offering people or that I'm doing, at least for me, like my intro deck is very focused on kind of my social media philosophy and the methodology that I use to kind of arrive at a good social strategy. So mine tends to be kind of philosophical. Knowing you, Maria, my guess is that yours kind of dips into philosophical, but is it practical? Are you putting like the like more like get to deal stuff in it, or is it pretty high level and just kind of like thought piece-y?
It's a bit of both these days. And that's a great example of plan to pivot. We wrote our introduction deck 4 years ago. I can honestly tell you without exaggeration that I update it weekly.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one.
So, you don't write it, you introduce yourself and you leave it alone. It's the way you are as a person. You change, you evolve. And I think that's the way this thing lives and breathes. But again, Joe, it's an amazing tool to focus yourself. I'm sure it was the hardest thing in the world, from like, I have this idea of what I want to do to I have 10 slides and it better, all be sort of condensed onto that, because if it's not, then I actually don't know what I'm doing.
Totally. And like 5 of those got to be like case studies. So it's like, whoa, what am I even saying here? There's a question on education background in the chat. And I know that you both have like a really interesting and like perspective on continuing education. I feel like every time I talk to you guys, you're taking some new class. Would love to hear about, like education background and what, like, how do you stay curious? Like, how do you keep an eye out for like new classes, or like, how do you pick what you're gonna take now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of background, my entire background was in managerial economics and statistics. Like 95% of people who took the courses I did ended up in finance. It just wasn't for me.
It sounds like you're saying like you're like the Charlie Brown teacher when you say those words to me.
Yeah, wah, 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 wah. Exactly. And it was just, essentially, it's funny because I am creative by nature, in the sense that like, I think I can paint, and like, I like design, and, I'm into fashion, but like, I can't say I'm good at it. So I'm good at math. And so I wanted to take what I was good at and apply it to something I liked. Like, I'm one of the lucky ones who netted out positive. I don't think that always works, but what happened, is I ended up in this more creative role, blah, blah, blah. 15 years go by, here's GoodQues. Now, I think it's more important than ever for us to stay educated, because it constantly brings up new ideas. So Maria and I are both enrolled in Masters of Psychology at Harvard right now, taking the classes remotely. Again, because, if you think about research and empathy, who knows that best than a psychologist, right? Like, let's just call a spade a spade. Like, I might have a great background in statistics and in managerial economics, and I worked in advertising for 15 years, but I'm not going to understand a human the way a psychologist can. So we started doing that. I will tell you that once you get this knee deep into a business, it is a little bit hard to maintain a master's.
I can imagine.
So we actually have a board of psychologists that we reference now. Put that on a little bit of a pause, which, we can talk about in a little bit. And then when it comes to other classes, it's honestly all about just like staying stimulated. So, we took a class on how to write about yourself, like literally like how to write a one pager about you and a personal experience, right? We've taken classes on how to better understand AI. We've taken classes on like as simple as Tableau, right? I think for us, the way we navigate it is, what's something that could inspire an aspect of work, whether or not we think it's interesting, it always comes out with something of like, hey, I've never thought about it that way. And for me, what I always try to do is just stimulate different aspects of my brain. I'm always in the data, so it's interesting for me to learn and educate myself on other aspects of the business. So yeah, that's my background. That's what we're kind of working in now. And, that's kind of what we always tell employees, like take classes, educate yourself, like stimulate yourself, figure out what you want to do to shape shift the business based on what you learn.
That's super interesting. So it's not necessarily just kind of like finding the things that seem interesting to you or that like are aligned with kind of like personally what you're interested in. It's like you have a vision of this will improve my ability to do my job at GoodQuest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's our whole ethos. Like, because for us, it's like, we're all about creative research, right? But creative can only go as far as your knowledge base goes or as far as your exposure goes. So, I mean, we can take an art class and be like, holy shit, it'd be great if we made our decks look like X. Like that can inspire us. And honestly, it has. We've talked to publishers before and been like, why aren't our decks zines? Like, why don't we do that? Why, like, you know what I mean? There's like constant room for innovation. And I think that's what keeps us going back to that.
Interesting. All right, Maria, what's your education background like? And do you agree with Holland or no?
Yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet, but my education background. So I went to art school pretty much my whole life. So I was an art nerd, but I'm also an immigrant. I came over when I was 7. So my parents told me, you being an artist over our dead bodies. So then they sent me to get a business degree. I got a business degree and ended up in advertising because honestly, the logic was as simple of, well, I can't do art to make a living. And now I have this business degree. Well, I can monetize creativity and here we go, advertising. Like it was that like 1-to-1. And I ended up where I am today, kind of on this journey of honestly just trying on different hats. Then I would say my best education has been the real world. I started interning when I was 18, full-time too, through the whole entire year, fall, summer, spring, and then, learned my way up. And I will say from an education perspective, it's actually one of the things I do agree with Holland wholeheartedly. And we talk about also just having a suite of experiences as you get more senior. So for me, I've had background in obviously being a brand manager, but also project management and also production. And also copywriting and also account management, right? And by the time you're 15 years into your career and you have all those things under your belt, it does allow you to be creative because you can pull from all those different competencies and you can say, okay, well, this is what I learned in this role, and I could bring it to being a researcher. So, I would say, again, to Holland's point, education, there's like the baseline of what you do with a degree. Then there's the stuff that inspires you, and that can come from anywhere and apply it to work.
Totally.
And then there's just the real life practical education of just getting a crazy amount of experience in different things.
Yeah, that's like, so when I was in school, I had a very similar path. Like I was an art student. I was like, I'm going to be an artist. All the other stuff is stupid. I don't really care. But I eventually had to pick up like an advertising and, writing thing because I was like, what am I going to do at the end of this? But I look back on that and like to me, that art education of like, it is not put the numbers in the right formula and you will get the right answer. Like life's problems are not that way. Life's problems are much more like there's a blank canvas in front of you. There's a billion ways to solve this problem. You just need to solve it in a way that's like aesthetic and pleases your audience. So that was a long-winded way of asking you both, what has been like the most surprisingly interesting or surprisingly useful class or education route that you've taken? I'll go to Holland first.
That is a tough one. I will say that in terms of surprising, actually, I do have a good one. It wasn't a long class by any means, but I think one of the biggest issues, and again, I'm speaking more on the data side of things, is that you have data and you need to articulate it. Yeah, you could put it in a sentence, but a lot of clients want to see it. How do you do it, Joe? We were talking about this before we got on, and not a bar chart. So I just took a data visualization class and I thought it was just going to be like, okay. And I can tell you it's completely shapeshifted the way that we present our data. So for me, that was quite surprising because, we talk about data storytelling and I think you think of the text a lot, right? When you think of a story, but a picture, what is it? A picture says 1,000 words.
Yeah.
Quite literally, right? And so there's importance to there too. And I think I knew it was important, but for me, it was quite surprising in the sense of like, we're working on a presentation now where like there's not a single bar chart. Like it literally looks like a comic book and it's beautiful, but all of the data is there. And it just makes it more digestible. It makes people want to read it more. And, I think, again, for me, that not like, it's more of a design thing, if you will, right? Like that's not really my skill set, but being able to apply it to what I'm good at. And again, that's kind of the constant theme, is quite useful for me. That's always where it becomes surprising.
And it would be super easy for a designer to say, well, it's not my job to figure out how to show the data. I'm just making it beautiful. So it's like, yeah, those moments where you kind of like cross discipline, I feel like that's where a true kind of like transformation or innovation happens. So that makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about you, Maria? Any like surprisingly interesting education experiences, or I don't know, places you didn't expect to learn?
That's a good one. I mean, I think for me, actually, again, I'll go back to, I think my philosophy has always been sort of the real life experience thing. And one of the ones that I feel very lucky to have gotten when I was a kid, I was 19, was I worked for almost a year in an ad production department for a company called Heavy.com, which was like one of the original sort of competitors of College Humor. And it was really interesting because I've never ended up doing any kind of ad production, right? Especially like in that time when we talked about, it was digital ad production. So it literally meant like, how do you make sure you have the right sizes of units, right? Back then we were doing all sort of display media, right? On like websites and stuff. What does it mean to be above the scroll line versus below, all that, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, and I never ended up doing anything with it, but it gave me such a great foundational knowledge of digital that when, a little bit later, and this is showing my age a little bit, but, when I entered the work world, that's when like digital was suddenly shaking up advertising and creativity and brands. And, when everyone was like, oh my God, they were freaking out. They're like, what does it mean to be a digital strategist, right? Which like now seems insane to even say out loud, especially on a Reddit, sort of discussion. But back then people were freaking out and I was like, yeah, no problem. Like, give me this thing. Like, I'll figure it out. I'll be a digital strategist, and it's just another way of like putting on a hat and not being afraid of it and having that experience that I never ended up doing any kind of digital ad production, but it was one of the most worthwhile things I've ever done because it took away my fear of digital at the right time when digital was picking up.
That's super interesting. I feel like those kind of like ground level experiences of like, this is how the sausage gets made, basically, right? It's like this like real tangible, it's got to fit in this. We're not talking like big level strategy. You got to get a freaking thing in the unit. That's like very much it was a jarring experience to go from big agency world to Reddit, because it was like the ad practice at the time was banners. It was like, there was no in feed. There was like a little kind of custom unit at the top of the Reddit page, which like premium advertisers use, but it's like, it was banner placements and brands wanting to understand how do we buy programmatically so that we get like the cheapest, whatever, cost per click or cost CPM or whatever. And that's just
I literally still dream in banner sizes based on that internship that I had. Yeah, I know.
I think that's a great answer too. Well, I want to be mindful of time, and also if there are any other questions, it looks like we've dwindled a little bit in our audience here, but if there are any other questions, please feel free to chime in and unmute. Let's see, you know what, we could, if you have time for one more, I would love to like hear, especially knowing that you've worked on Bitstamp, any thoughts on like all the Web3 predictions and like what's happening in NFT space and brand NFTs, which like most of them seem like PR plays to me, but I'm open if you want to argue with me the other way. What's been interesting in that space for you guys?
I'll give you a personal thing that I think is going to happen, and then professionally. So personally, I think that people are going to really have a hard time with something being completely intangible. So for example, anything that you're getting intangible, people are still like trying to make it tangible. So an NFT, people are like putting it on a digital screen and hanging it. I've seen NFTs by restaurants, which is like you own the NFT and it's a gift card, but you still go in and get a drink, right? I think what's going to succeed is the people who can link the intangible to a tangible experience ultimately. Yeah. That's my general thought. Web3 and all of that, for me, this is the loss of cookies on crack, right? So essentially, you know, people, we can track people less when people are out on the internet on their own, not through these kind of like sanctioned platforms where they're in control of their own data. It's going to make research so much more important. And I'm not just saying that to sell myself, like quite literally, there's going to be no way to track what people do. Everyone, it's going to be on blockchain. You own your own data. Like, yes, it'll be encrypted forever, but like no one is going to be able to sell data the way it's happening right now. And because of that, we're going to need to figure out through research, like what's actually motivating people, what people are actually feeling, because that contextual environment that you get through cookies, et cetera, is going to completely dissipate.
I'm here for it. I'm ready for advertisers to have to earn their keep again. And I like one of the, I don't like know how tangible this is a prediction, but like I feel like this idea that brands will lose this ability to simply buy in to the places we frequent is going to be such a radical change for so many of the traditional brands. And it's just going to lean into what so many of us have been saying for so long, that it's so much more about adding genuine value than it is about like nailing like your most efficient media strategy. It's like it's an important tactic, but that is not that should not be the guiding principle that like keeps your business afloat.
It's really interesting. I heard one thing from a friend of mine recently that again just shifted my perspective on ads and how brands can think about it. So she said to me, I'm in the market for new plates. So all I had to do was I had to search for new plates on Instagram. She's like, and now I know for the next 2 weeks, I'll see nothing but plate ads. She's like, and so that's great. She's like, because Instagram is doing the work for me. She's like, I don't have to search. I don't have to like look for stuff. It'll serve it to me and I'll find something I like.
Yeah.
And I found that fascinating. I mean, people are kind of gaming the system. And to some degree, you can argue the platforms aren't doing a good job, right? If they're just serving you every competitor of plates that exists out there, you're kind of pinning, that against each other. So it's a fascinating thing. And I do wonder, people are going to continue to manipulate sort of the system. And, if Web 3.0 will be easy and if they can keep their data, they're going to do it. And then advertisers, to your point, have to figure out value.
I'm here. I'm so ready for that day. I feel like that's like the brands that I love are already doing it. The brands that I kind of can't stand refuse to do it. Like let's see it unfold. It'll be a fun next 20 years to watch. Well, thank you both so much for the time. I know the community is itching to hear the recording. So this will get posted up on YouTube tomorrow. Any parting wisdom, any parting words? I feel like you've already given us so much, so happy to end it here. But maybe if you want to make a note about GoodQues and like kind of what's in store for the future for you guys.
I think as far as GoodQues, exactly what we said over and over again. We're going to keep evolving. Hopefully we call ourselves the anti-research company, and hopefully we can, stand up to that name. Otherwise, in terms of parting words, if anyone has questions, the community, follow-ups, we love the discussion. We're very open people. So please reach out. And otherwise, just thank you so much for your time. Thank you for, allowing us to have a voice. And we're very grateful to be here.
Oh, we should note that, that Maria and Holland have hired an r/advertising school student. So, if you're listening this long, get in touch with these two. All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody.